Everything will be alright if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
On November 24th, 1990, the temperature in Saskatoon dropped to a minus 28 degrees Celsius. That night, a 17-year-old Salto boy named Neil Stonechild was seen alive for the last time. Witnesses said he was in the back of a police cruiser, his face bloodied, screaming to a friend that they were going to kill him. 5 days later, Neil's body was found in a remote field on the outskirts of the city. He was wearing a light jacket and only one shoe. There were marks on his wrists, described by some investigators as being consistent with handcuff marks. Police closed the case in 3 days. They called it Misadventure. The story of a drunk kid who wandered off and froze to death. For more than a decade, that was the official truth. Until another survivor came forward and gave the practice a name, Starlight Tours. But Neil Stonechild's story isn't just about a single night in November. It's part of a much larger history of how Indigenous lives were handled by the state. From residential schools to cases that seem to disappear into silence. This is the story of what happens when an entire people learn that the system meant to protect them might not protect them at all. Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, winter of 1990. By late November, the cold didn't just settle in. It took over everything. Minus 28 degrees Celsius. Cold so sharp that it burned your lungs when you breathed. Cold that turned tears into ice. Cold that could kill a person in minutes if they were alone. And in certain parts of the city, Indigenous people already knew that they were more vulnerable than most. For years, there had been stories. Stories of Native men picked up by police late at night, driven to the edge of town, and abandoned in the freezing dark. Most people dismissed them as rumors, urban legends. But among Indigenous families in Saskatchewan, those stories traveled quietly, from relative to relative, friend to friend. Warnings. At 17 years old, Neil Stonechild was still just a kid. Friends described him as funny, social, restless. The kind of teenager trying to figure out who he was, while moving through a world already making assumptions about him. And on the night of November 24th, 1990, Neil disappeared into that cold. When he was finally found, his body was lying in a frozen field on the outskirts of Saskatoon. Police moved quickly. Too quickly, some people thought. Within days, the case was effectively closed. The official explanation? Misadventure. A drunk teenager, alone in the snow. A tragic accident. But for many Indigenous people in Saskatoon, the story didn't sit right. Because by then, too many people had heard the rumors. And too many families had their own stories. To understand the field where Neil died, you have to understand the rooms where it began. Long before the Starlight Tours, there were the schools. They called them industrial schools, residential schools, boarding schools. Places designed, in their own words, to kill the Indian in the child. The machine started at the front gate. It started with their hair. For these children, long hair was sacred. a connection to family, to identity, and to the earth. And the first thing many of them felt was the cold bite of the shears. Imagine the weight of your identity falling into clumps on a dusty floor, being shorn like an animal, made to look like everyone else, so you could disappear like everyone else. And then there was the language. Imagine waking from a dream, speaking the only words you know, the words your grandmother whispered to you, the words that named the trees, the rivers, and the stars. Now imagine speaking those words in the hallway and feeling a hand clamp around your jaw. They called it cleansing, the burn of the lye soap, the bitter chemical sting as they scrubbed the inside of your mouth, gagging, choking, the taste of lye replacing the taste of home. They wanted the language to feel dirty. They wanted your own voice to feel like punishment. Imagine the dormitories, rows of narrow iron beds, the smell of floor wax and sickness, and the sound, not children laughing, but coughing, a deep, wet, rattling cough that never stopped. Tuberculosis, the white plague. Government inspectors warned that the schools were overcrowded, poorly ventilated, and dangerously unsanitary. Children were malnourished. Disease spread from bed to bed. At some schools, death rates became staggering. And when the coughing finally stopped, many children never went home. Some were buried on school grounds, far from their families, far from the community still searching for them generations later. For decades, many families were told there was nothing there at all, until the ground started answering back. Unmarked graves, tiny shoes, small bodies buried beside the school that were supposed to save them. Children who disappeared twice, once from their families, and again from history. The system didn't fail these children. The system was working exactly as intended. Because once a people have been stripped of their names, their language, their hair, they're dead, it becomes very easy to leave them freezing in a field 80 years later. The cold was always there. By the time Neil Stonechild disappeared, people in Saskatoon already had a name for it. Starlight Tours. The story was always the same. An Indigenous person picked up by police late at night, driven to the edge of the city, left in the cold. No coat, no ride home, no witnesses. Just the sound of gravel under tires and the slow realization that the cold itself had become the weapon. Most people outside Indigenous communities had never heard the stories. Or if they had, they treated them like rumors. Urban legends. The kind of thing people whisper about after midnight, because the alternative was harder to accept. That people sworn to protect the public might understand exactly what minus 30 degrees can do to a human body. Neil Stonechild was 17 years old. Salto, a kid. Witnesses saw him in the back of a police cruiser the night he disappeared, his face bloodied. One friend later recalled Neil yelling, "They're going to kill me." 5 days later, his body was found frozen in a field on the outskirts of Saskatoon. He was wearing a thin jacket and only one shoe. There were marks on his wrist that witnesses believe resembled handcuff marks. Police closed the case in 3 days. 3 days. That was it. The official conclusion? Misadventure. A drunk teenager who wandered into the cold. Case closed. But there were problems. A lot of problems. Neil's body was found miles from where he was last seen. Witnesses contradicted police statements. And Indigenous residents in Saskatoon had been warning about Starlight Tours for years. Still, almost nobody listened. Because once a system decides whose testimony matters, silence becomes easy to manufacture. And in Saskatoon, silence had become routine. Until someone survived. Because the thing about rumors is eventually one of them comes back alive. For years, Starlight Tours existed in a strange place. Everybody in certain communities seemed to know about them. And almost nobody in power acknowledged them. The stories traveled quietly. Through families, through cousins, through warnings whispered late at night. Don't walk alone. Don't get stranded downtown. Don't trust the ride. Because people understood something terrifying. In a prairie winter, you don't need a gun. The cold will do the work for you. And for years, that was the shield. No witnesses. No bodies that could talk. Just another death ruled exposure. Another file closed. Another family left with questions. Until someone came back. In January of 2000, a Cree man named Daryl Knight was picked up by Saskatoon police officers. At first, nothing seemed unusual. A police stop. Questions. A ride in the cruiser. The kind of interaction thousands of people have had with police every day. But instead of taking him home, the officers drove him out of the city. Into the freezing dark. Near a power plant on the outskirts of Saskatoon. And then they left him there. Alone. In the middle of winter. Temperatures that night dropped to around minus 22 Celsius. Daryl Knight later described trying to walk through the snow. Trying to stay awake. Trying not to freeze before he found help. And somehow, he survived. That survival changed everything. Because suddenly, the rumors had a witness. A living person describing the exact thing Indigenous communities had been warning about for years. And once people started listening, other stories began surfacing too. Stories that sounded painfully familiar, including the death of Neil Stonechild. Questions that had once been dismissed suddenly became harder to ignore. Why had Neil been seen in the back of a police cruiser? Why were there marks on his wrists? Why had the case been closed so quickly? Why had so many people been willing to accept that a 17-year-old boy simply wandered into a frozen field alone? An inquiry would eventually re-examine Neil Stonechild's death, and the conclusions were devastating. The original investigation had been deeply flawed. Key witnesses had not been properly followed up on. Important evidence had been ignored, and the inquiry concluded that there was reason to believe Neil had likely been in contact with police officers before his death. For Indigenous people in Saskatoon, none of this felt shocking. That may be the most disturbing part of the entire story. Not that people were horrified when they heard it, but that so many people had already believed it was possible. For many Indigenous families, Neil Stonechild's story never really ended, because the fear never ended. Girls still disappear. Families still wait for phone calls that never come. Mothers still hang flyers on telephone poles, still organize searches. still walk riverbanks and back roads themselves, because too many of them have learned a terrifying lesson. Sometimes nobody is coming. Across the United States and Canada, thousands of Indigenous women and girls have been reported missing or murdered. Many cases receive little media attention. Some were never properly investigated. Some families say they were dismissed immediately. Told their daughter probably ran away. Told to wait. Told not to worry. And sometimes, those first few hours are everything. There's a phrase that appears again and again in these stories. They didn't take us seriously. That sentence shows up everywhere. In interviews, in documentaries, in testimony, in grieving parents' voices. Not anger at first. Recognition. Like they already expected not to be heard. And maybe that's the real legacy of stories like Neil Stonechild's. Not just the violence itself, but what repeated violence teaches people to expect. Distrust doesn't appear overnight. It's learned. Learned through history, through schools, through disappearances, through investigations that families believe were rushed, ignored, or abandoned. And through silence, because silence can become its own kind of system. Some disappearances become national obsessions, round-the-clock coverage, special reports, endless headlines, while others barely seem to register outside the communities they devastate. And when families see that pattern over and over again, they begin to understand something painful. Some stories are treated like national tragedies, others are treated like statistics. I was 12 years old when Neil Stonechild died. Growing up Indigenous in a rural community, I understood certain things early. The slurs, the fistfights, the feeling that some people already decided who you were before you ever opened your mouth. And looking at pictures of Neil, honestly, he looked like me. That's part of what makes this story so hard to shake. Because Neil Stonechild wasn't ancient history. This wasn't the 1890s, or the frontier, or some distant black and white photograph. This was 1990. The year Home Alone came out. The year kids were trading Nintendo cartridges at school. The year people watched The Fresh Prince on television. And somewhere in that same year, a 17-year-old Indigenous boy froze to death in a field outside Saskatoon. While people argued over whether his life mattered enough to investigate properly. That isn't ancient history. That's now. And maybe that's why stories like this matter. Because systems depend on people forgetting. Forgetting names. Forgetting faces. Forgetting children. Forgetting graves. But history becomes dangerous the moment people refuse to forget anymore. If you're still here, thank you. This was a heavy and personal episode for me to make, and I appreciate you hanging out with me. Stories like these are important to remember. So if you can, share this story. Help people remember Neil Stonechild's name. And I hope to see you all back here next week for another story that our history books left out. My name's David, and this is the Underground Syllabus.